is Kica Matos, and I am your host. On the show, we talk about our community, our city, and the world, but always, we always do it through a social justice lens. So let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about policing, and specifically policing in New Haven. We're going to talk about the good, we're going to talk about the bad, and we're going to talk about the ugly. But before I do that, let me do a little bit of framing. New Haven was once seen as a beacon of light and on the cutting edge of community policing. The chief architect of community policing was Nick Pastor, who served as chief of police in New Haven from 1990 to 1997. Chief Pastor had an approach that focused on reducing crime instead of increasing arrests. He emphasized the importance of working with community, and he actively encouraged officers to walk the streets, to talk to people, and to do outreach. In a 1991 interview in the New York Times, Chief Pastor outlined his vision for 21st century policing. He said that in this, our century, quote, "you're not going to spend $30,000 for one Black inmate. Instead, quote, you're going to send him to Yale, you're going to send him to the University of New Haven." Quality of life for him was the basis for change. During his tenure, Chief Pastor was seen as a national leader and one of the first police chiefs in the nation to embrace community policing as a fundamental philosophy. Since then, community policing in New Haven has ebbed and flowed. While police chiefs have continuously embraced the concept of community policing, the truth is that the rhetoric doesn't always translate into the reality. For example, in 2009, the New Haven Independent wrote an article entitled "Goodbye Community Policing" that noted the efforts of then Chief Lewis to move away from community policing. This included changing the slogan of police cars from "committed to community policing" to "dedicated to protecting our community." In 2003, after Dean Esserman became chief, he vowed a return to community policing, stating that, quote, "you don't have to love the New Haven Police Department. You just have to love your beat cop. We talk to people and people talk to us. It's not just about contacts. It's about learning humility and developing trust." Today in New Haven, debates about community policing have resurfaced recently, including over the last week or so after Mayor Elliker moved to appoint a chief of police without input from either the community or the police commissioners. In the studio with me today are two city residents who are experts in policing. First is Professor Tracy Mears. Professor Mears is the Walter Hale Hamilton Professor of Law at Yale Law School. She's a nationally recognized expert on policing in urban communities. Her research focuses on understanding how members of the public think about their relationships with legal authorities, including the police, prosecutors, and also judges. In December of 2014, President Obama named her as a member of his task force on 21st century policing. She's also a member of the New Haven Board of Police Commissioners. Welcome, Professor Mears.
Thanks for having me, Kica.
Sure thing. My other guest is Alder-elect Shafiq Abduzabur. He is a retired police sergeant who once served as district manager in New Hallville. Shafiq is an author of two books: A Black Man's Guide, Driving While Black, and A Black Man's Guide to Law Enforcement in America. Shafiq, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon.
Let me start out by asking you a very basic question, and I'm going to start with Professor Mears. What exactly is community policing?
It's a really important question. It's a very difficult question to answer, and it might not seem so when we're talking about it in New Haven. So let me just say a couple of things. A preface before I answer. As you mentioned, Kica, I am a commissioner on the Board of Police Commissioners. I am speaking here in my capacity as a law professor who has studied these issues for over 27 years. And that I want folks to understand that that's the perspective that I'm offering right now. I'm speaking to you from a hotel room in Chicago, which is also a place that has a long history on community policing. A book written by Wes Scogan called Community Policing Chicago Style actually owes a great debt to Nick Pastor's work in New Haven. So at a basic level, community policing is about understanding that the best way to ensure that people comply with the law and are engaged in projects of safety is because they have internalized the idea of the importance of compliance. And that means that you have to develop trust. This is a different conception from compliance, from one that assumes that people obey the law because they fear the consequences of failing to do so. That approach will emphasize arrests and threats of punishment and so on. A trust-based approach depends on ensuring that people have voice, number one. Number two, are treated with dignity and respect. Number three, can perceive that decisions on outcomes that involve them are fair, that is, they're transparent, without bias, based in facts. And finally, people believe that the decision maker, the legal authority, the police officer, is someone that they can expect to treat them benevolently in the future. I like to say the summary of all this is, in short, in their interactions with police, people want to believe that the legal authority they're dealing with believes that they count. And they make that assessment based on how they're being treated. Now, that's a high level way of doing it, but understand what I didn't say. I didn't say community policing is walking the beat, or community policing is, being on a bicycle or a horse or whatever. It's taking certain kinds of actions that could include those things, but don't necessarily have to be those things, that support the idea that people understand that they matter, that then leads to trust, that then leads to greater compliance, engagement, and cooperation. I think that's a good way to start.
Shafiq, you were once in the New Haven Department Police Force, and when we first met, I believe Chief Francisco Ortiz was Chief of Police, and he was a big proponent of community policing. Talk to us about what it actually means to be a law enforcement officer, putting community policing into practice. What did you do differently?
So I'm glad you didn't ask me to explain community policing, because I would not be able to outdo what Dr. Mears brought. So I'm a retired sergeant. I retired at the rank of sergeant. And as I've said throughout my career, there were very few officers that actually received in New Haven what we consider to be the community police training. So there was a training that came out of the Tree Institute, which was funded by the federal government. And the Tree Institute was responsible for creating all of these workshops and training to get you community-based police ready. But that training was not mandatory. So some of it was mandatory, and then some of it was optional. So I took both the mandatory and the optional training. The best way I can relate it is community policing is like they're like Jedis on Star Wars. You've got like your Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then all the way down, there's going to be a succession of officers who learn this work down to the next person. So the goal would be you would want policing to get stronger as it goes down the lineage. But what has happened with community policing is the farther we've gotten away from 1994, you have a weaker form of community policing. And so now it means so many different things to different people. Somebody says, oh, community policing is I have 2 officers assigned to the department that shakes kids' hands. And somebody else goes, well, we've got it on our cars. And then somebody else goes, no, we don't have 400 people on our SWAT team. So it's a different thing. But what we do know is this. Community policing is the type of policing that you don't have to look over your shoulder when a cop gets behind you because you're worried about being mistreated. Community policing is the type of policing that when your family member gets killed, the police and the community together do not orchestrate a narrative that they must have been doing something to get themselves killed. Community-based policing is the type of policing that the officer that has that uniform on is just as concerned about your safety as they would be of their mother's safety if their mother lived in the worst part of that community. And not only that they're concerned, but they're actively doing something about it. So that's police in the community doing things like I did when I was a cop, starting the first New Haven PD coat drive, right? Taking kids camping, coming up with a camping program, which is how me and you met through CT Rabat, because I was doing a gun violence prevention program for young people. So community policing also gets officers to get out of their car, get out of their headspace, and do something on their own time to help fix the problem around societal ills. And do they get paid for it when they do it? No. But that's the other part of community policing. It should wake up in a person the core of their public service, the part that is not funded by a paycheck.
Let's get a little bit more granular. You and I worked together in 2007 to stand up the Street Outreach Worker Program. And I remember I rode in your cop car one afternoon and we drove through New Hallville. And one of the things that struck me was that you took me to places where young people hung out, right? Because you wanted me to understand the street scene in New Haven. And one of the things that I was struck by was that when you took me to those places and young people were hanging out on the streets and they saw the police car, their faces went hard. But then when they saw it was you, their faces transformed and there was a welcoming. They smiled. They came immediately to you. They started talking to you. What was it that you did to get there in the context of community policing? Give me, I know it's hard to explain, but give me a fundamental.
So it's about relationships. So it's about relationships, so here's what people didn't know about me as an officer. I'm the guy that would come and put $300 in your hand when your kid got shot. Okay. Because I don't care how your kid got shot. I know you need money. When people die, people need money. People don't have suits. I was the officer that when family members got murdered, I knew that one of their biggest anxiety was I have nothing to wear to the funeral. So I would go in my closet and grab a tuxedo or a couple of suits or buy whatever that was needed. When you build those kind of relationships with people off the grid, that's what people remember. I remember one of the most striking things. I was a rookie officer. I think I had about 2.5 years on the job, and it was a call in Hamilton Street projects. It was like 5 people got shot. They shot them all in the little splash pad in the middle of the night. I was off duty. I responded there with another sergeant because there was no backup. So I drove there in my personal car off duty. I was still coming out to PD. We got there. There was about 5 black males laying on the ground. 2 were definitely dead. 3 others, they were on their way to the hospital. And one of the people that came out there screaming was one of the guy's girlfriends, and she was like, "That's my baby's father. I don't know what to do." And nobody would talk to her. She's like, she couldn't get to the ambulance. Ambulance had taken off already. Well, she jumped in my car. I put in my car. I said, I'll take you to the hospital. I don't remember having contact with her again, but it's those type of relationships. People, the community remembers, man. They've got like their own urban Facebook of credibility with people when it comes to public servants. And so you build those basic relationships with people, and they know when that's Shafiq, man. That's my dude, and you just build on that. So when you get out, they don't care who about the police. They're like, you're a resource. You're someone who cares. You are family, right? And that, Francisco Ortiz, since we mentioned him, he was one of my mentors. And he told me, he said, Shafiq, the only thing you got to remember about policing, it's all about relationships.
And he was from Chicago. Can I just jump in really quickly?
Yes, go for it.
Because, Shafiq did above and beyond. We can't expect everybody to do that. So if that's the definition of community policing, I think we're doomed to fail. However, what you can do is distill these ideas about the importance of relationship and the importance of trust. And hopefully you have an administration that orients itself toward that being the project rather than cops on dots, or the project is about prevention and trust and safety, and importantly, understanding that a police agency is an agent. And if you are an agent, then that means you have, in legal terms, a principal. The principal tells the agent what to do. It should be that the community is the principal and the police agencies are the agent and not the other way around. And too often, too many agencies are oriented around, well, how can the community help us do our job, rather than how can we properly serve the community's goals and projects.
Thank you for that. So that brings us really to the moment that we find ourselves in. I mentioned earlier that Mayor Elicker announced recently that he intended to appoint the interim chief, Rene Dominguez, as permanent chief of police. And there's been some opposition to this nomination from people in the community. And by way of example, just a few days ago, a coalition of immigrant rights, Latino, and African American community leaders held a press conference, and they spoke out forcefully against this appointment. And they raised a bunch of issues that call into question the department's commitment to community policing. Advocates have pointed to a number of troubling issues with this nomination. And let me just mention a few, because I think they go to the heart of community policing and what we need to do to get back there. They include the chief's embrace of Blue Lives Matter and the thin blue line flags, which are symbols that are seen as racially divisive and as a symbol that advances an us versus them mentality in the police force. People point to the escalating rates of violence in the city, coupled with the staggering numbers of unsolved homicides. And for point of reference, the homicide closure rate for Hartford is 70%, 7-0. In New Haven, it's 20%. People are upset about the lack of a process in nominating the chief. The mayor made the decision without talking to anyone, without doing a national search. There was no community input, and as I understand it, not even the police commissioners were consulted or informed. And finally, there's the issue of race and representation. Since Dominguez took office earlier this year, top-ranking Black and Latino cops have left the department and have left the New Haven Police Department without either a chief, assistant chief, or captain of color for the first time since 1993. Last August, Chief Dominguez promoted 14 officers, 12 of them were white. So let's break this down. Professor Mears, you're a police commissioner, you mentioned earlier. I'm curious to know whether the commission was involved in or informed about the decision to appoint a chief. And more importantly, what do you think the ideal or standard process should be in place for nominating a chief of police in New Haven?
I was not until the night before the press conference, and I was not asked my opinion about that. What I can say about what I think the right process is to go back to the 4 principles of procedural justice, which I said that people are more likely to have confidence in and trust in legal authorities and agencies when those 4 principles are observed. They are voice, being given an opportunity to give your point of view, have input into a policy, and so on. Second, being treated with dignity and respect, concern for your rights, listened to, which is related to point 1. Third, making sure that decision makers show evidence of a fair process, neutrality, lack of bias, transparency, very important. And fourth, as I already said, give evidence of trustworthy motives. That is, in your dealings with people want to believe that you believe that they count. And so all of these things can be done with aspects of process, which are actually different from ultimate outcomes. So I don't actually have to have, or people don't actually have to have, a strongly held opinion about the person that's separate from the question of what kind of process is undertaken in order to choose that person. I will also say that, in my view, New Haven has been in the past and should be a nationally ranked city. And, you know, if you are going to be a nationally ranked city, then one way to think about that is to have a nationally focused process. That's clearly not what happened here. And, you know, Mayor Elicker is entitled to do whatever he wants with respect to appointing the police chief. However, my research suggests that those decisions will be given more credence. It will be considered more credible and trustworthy when one uses a different process. One last thing I want to say, in case I lose power before we're done here, on the diversity of the leadership. The way it works is the mayor can choose the chief and have a process that he wants. The assistant chiefs actually have to be approved by the police commission. And all of the other leadership, the promotions that you mentioned, also have to be approved by the commission according to the civil service rules, testing and so forth. What people may not understand, and I think this is incredibly important, is the union rules in the city of New Haven require that anybody who comes from outside actually start at the bottom. So if you have a very qualified senior official who wants to move to New Haven from another city with lots of experience, who is a lieutenant or captain, say, that person cannot actually be hired into the New Haven department without first starting at the bottom and working the way up to the top. So when people are looking to how the diversity of the leadership is going to be addressed, right now, the only option, because of the way the rules of New Haven operate, are to look to see who's coming up the pipeline. And so there is a real sense of that is what it is, because that's who the people are right now. And then if people leave, that just changes the ranks in certain ways. That is not true for the chief and the 4 assistant chiefs. Those people can be brought in from elsewhere. And the chief is also entitled to not elevate people just according to rank. The chief can pick people who are lower down in the hierarchical chain and make that person an assistant chief if they want. So I hope folks find, those facts helpful to thinking about this.
So in essence, we have a structural problem, and the only way that we're going to see leadership of color is if, assuming that the Dominguez nomination goes through, and that's open to question because it has to be subjected to aldermanic votes. It's really up to the chief of police to diversify the leadership of the New Haven Police Department. Is that right?
The very top rank. And as far as like the lieutenants and captains and so on, that's going to be difficult to change unless some pressure is placed on these union rules that require people from the outside who could have serious leadership experience and not require them to start from the bottom as rookies and make their way up.
Shafiq, I have 2 questions for you. Since Tracy tackled both of these, I'm going to fire them off at you, and they're related. The first is, why is it important for police departments to do a national search? And I guess I'm asking this question assuming that you are a proponent of a national search moving forward. And why does race matter? I mean, I can imagine some people are listening to this radio show saying, we just want good law enforcement officers. Race doesn't matter. So talk to me about both of these things.
So, what Dr. Mears talked about, which actually requires a whole nother show. Departments often lack diversity because of the culture of policing. The culture can dictate who gets what and who goes where. The way people move through the police department is something that I looked at when I came on, and as being the president of the National Black Police Association, something I had to deal with police departments all across the country with black officers. One of the problems we have in New Haven right now is our hiring and our police academy. For some reason in the hiring process, and this has been the history of policing in New Haven since I became a cop in 1996, if you are a black male and you are a New Haven resident and you apply to the New Haven Police Department, you've got a better chance of catching a snowball in hell than you do getting on that department. It is extraordinarily difficult. I don't know if it's because the characterization of New Haven being, like a, drug dealer kind of city. And, if you're a black male, you come on, you just gotta, my son's on. Yes, my son, Ismail Dusabar, is on. He is my son, and I have trained him to be a police officer. subconsciously to him since he wanted and showed interest in the 8th grade. But I recognize that there's other people out there that did not have Shafiq as their father. But you should not have to have Shafiq as your father to be qualified to get on and have all of the rules changed on you, or your credit score is not high enough, or you looked at your boss the wrong way. So I really implore that the police commission really take a stronger look at how many people are applying, who's getting on, who's not getting on. Break that cycle. I mean, if you don't get your head chopped off during the process, you get your head chopped off in FTO, and there's a lot of subjugation of people's opinion that can go on to that. That's how you begin to increase the diversity. You want diversity. That's number one. Number two, something that we were challenged with during Esserman's reign. We recognize that you have to have other processes in place to develop leadership in the police department. Leadership should not begin when I'm a lieutenant, when I'm a sergeant, and when I'm a captain. We should be bringing young officers on with a leadership mentality from day one and with opportunities for them to be able to access this. I used to tell, when I was in there, I told, then it was Chief Sharp, he was the assistant chief, I said, I would love to see these walls being used, that when you're walking down these halls in the police department, that the patrol officer can see themselves, this is how you get from a patrol officer to chief, and actually showing the flow chart steps. So we're not even running a department in a way that creates leadership. That's the other part. The other side of this is community policing and strategic policing is utilizing your asset. If you don't see Black, Hispanic, and Latino officers as an asset, then they won't be an asset. Mm-hmm. So if you're very comfortable with the entire room looking homogeneous, and you're thinking that's your best product that's going to come out of there, then you're going to have 545 unsolved shootings over the last 7 years. You're going to have that because the community that's getting shot is 80% Black men. So if you got one Black female detective, and it's okay with that, then that's what you're gonna get. So there has to be a mental priority shift on how do we make people safe and who needs the most safety in our city. And I would agree with Tracy. Some of it is a little contractual. I think you're gonna find it hard for many departments to have anybody that's can lateral transfer into a supervised position. But at the same time,
not in big cities.
Well, not in a big city, but at the same time, where I would agree with the mayor. He did a boss move. He said in the paper, he said, I'm the mayor, I get to make appointments. And I get that. And he's rightfully so. I would just say, if I had somebody like Tracy Mears, Dr. Mears, or Mike Lawler on my board of police commission, I probably would want to have a dialogue about the broader impacts of just what the police department should look like. And here's the other thing. We are either under a perf report guidance or we're not under perf report guidance. And if we're under the perf report guidance, Dr. Mears, that says we use the 4-chief model. And there's reasons why we use that. And the rest of that needs to be fully implemented. Or we're not doing that. And we need the Board of Police Commissioner to come up with what is the new model. My concern is whether it's Chief Dominguez, it's Chief anybody. What I don't want to see happen in New Haven is that every time we get a new chief, we get a new direction to go. We need one direction for the city of New Haven when it comes to safety. And no matter who the chief is, they can come in and enhance that. But what we've been doing is we've just keep getting a new chief, and we got to look at too the tenure. Chiefs normally in New Haven, chiefs and assistant chiefs normally do no more than 2 years. Some 18 months. Some break a record and do like 4 months and then they're out. What are we going to do if when we make our next chief, whether it's Chief Dominguez or anybody else, and for whatever reason they leave in 6 months, 3 months or a year? Then what?
So Shafiq, should there be a national search or no?
I think you should do a national search just because that's the process that we used before. And I said this, hey, listen, let's just clean the dirt off the table. Campbell was the interim for Chief Esserman. Campbell was Mayor Harp's guy, but she still did a national search. She still did a national search. That was her guy, but she still did a national search. So, hey, Dominguez can still be Elliker's person, but still do a nationwide search because you want your person to match up against somebody out there. You don't want your person to just be like, this is my person. She's a newer, younger breed of chiefs, right? She's a post-pandemic assistant chief. You've got to give people the respect to be able to grow and operate. There's going to be challenges for anybody that would be chief. I said this. I consider myself pretty smart, and I consider myself to be very well capable to be a chief. And I can tell you this: if I came back to be the police chief in New Haven, I would have significant challenges with my national standing and what I know. So to put anybody else there, it's going to be extraordinary. And as Chief Darrell Roberts said, you can only police a community that allows you to police it. And that begins with relationships.
Yeah, and this process itself calls into question the idea of community engagement and community input, which goes back to Professor Muir's framing. We're coming to the end of the show, and as is my practice with my guests, now you get to be put on the personal hotspot now. So Shafiq and Professor Mears, here goes. If you could spend a weekend with anyone in the world, living or dead, who would it be and why? Professor Mears, the look on your face is hilarious. Let's start with you.
Okay, because I have 1% today, given everything I've lived with and all this today, I think the person I would want to spend a weekend with is Stacey Abrams, who understands not only a lot of the issues that I feel like I'm facing in terms of governance, but also even in my job at Yale Law School, who also seems to be a brilliant political strategist. So, theory-based, let's see what's in the world, but also a person who gets it done. She's just the first person who came to mind.
Shafiq.
It would be my grandmother who passed in March.
Oh.
Yeah, it would be my grandmother.
If you could wave a magic wand and make one social justice dream come true, what would it be? Professor Mears, we'll start with you.
That we would have a governance of public safety that's actually based on people's access to public goods, the public goods of safety. So not sort of worried about whether we're reducing crime, but understanding that safety requires access to housing, healthcare, real education. I mean, so that would be one way of doing it. Or another way of waving the magic wand is to say that Reconstruction did not end with white terrorism after 11 years, but that it became the fully realized project that W.E.B. Du Bois described in his book.
What about you, Shafiq?
Well, I would love to see us have a prison system and a criminal justice system that you would actually go to trade school when you are incarcerated, and you would develop a trade and get certified so that when you come out, that would be the condition. You must come out with a certified trade to be released.
Beautiful. And finally, we'll start with Professor Mears. What is your source of inspiration?
So there I'm going to go back to Shafiq's answer. My grandmother is my source of my inspiration. She was a civil rights activist. She was my favorite person in the world. And she told me that my life was not my own. And almost everything I do with her voice in my head.
Beautiful. What about you, Shafiq?
My ancestors, who did not have a choice being here in this country, but I do. And my goal is to continue to honor them and all the sacrifices that they made, some by not their choice and some, by choice, that I can honor that. I can honor the blood that they spilled in this soil and the sweat that they were not paid for, and the labor that they did.
Beautiful. Folks, that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for listening. Shafiq and Professor Mears, thank you very much for being on the show.
So much fun, and I've got 1%, so I probably will black out in like 2 seconds. Thanks so much.
Until the next one, to all the listeners out there, here is wishing you justice and many, many days of sunshine.
Ibarat